Hi there. I'm going to be talking here about the origins of sociology and sociological theory, their historical development. So I'm going to go to screen share mode to take us to your PowerPoint presentation. As I've emphasized a few times already, it's really important that we situate theory and ideas within the historical context in which they were developed, to see them as products of particular times and spaces in social history. And that is to say that, great ideas and great theories, they don't just like emerge in a vacuum. They don't just like develop from really smart people who are working in universities on in an ivory tower or sitting on a campus lawn, who think up these ideas in isolation. In fact, they are ideas that come from wrestling with the conflicts and the struggles and the issues that are going on at a particular time and place. And so for the historical context for the rise of sociological theory, we have a set of factors here, political, economic, religious, and intellectual factors that all kind of came together to contribute to the rise of sociology and sociological theory in roughly the period between the 16th century and the 19th century, is when these factors came into play in creating, the modern world. So roughly in the period of like the 1500s or the late 1400s, into the 1800s would be very decisive in creating this modern world and in giving rise to sociology and sociological theory. So the first of these that we look at is, an economic factor of the rise of capitalism, which really can be traced to at least back to the 16th century. And then the Industrial Revolution, which was a more recent phenomenon of, say the late 18th or early 19th centuries in Britain, and then, in the United States, more like in the mid 19th century. The rise of individualism and the Protestant Reformation, which one can consider to be more of a sort of a religious or cultural or intellectual factor in Europe and in the United States as well. The way in which like the Protestant Reformation, this kind of reform movement within Christianity that challenged some of the fundamental hierarchies of the Catholic Church, that sort of gave rise to a new kind of like culture of individualism that reshaped the way that people thought about themselves, thought about their relationship to religion, and arguably contributed to the rise of capitalism and other sort of economic processes as well. Third, we have here the process of colonization, white supremacy, slavery, and settler colonialism. The key benchmark date for these events, of course, is Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas in 1492, and then the sort of European colonization that and the slave trade that commences and really takes off in the 15th and 16th centuries in the Americas, and also in the Caribbean islands. And the ideology of like white supremacy and Eurocentrism that kind of comes about to legitimate, to rationalize and justify in slavery and these gross kinds of forms of inequality and exploitation that take root in the New World of the Western Hemisphere. Fourth, we have what could be considered like political factors of the rise of the nation state, and then the Age of Revolution, in which we have singled out three very important, epic revolutionary struggles that would, reshape the way that people thought about society and thought about, questions of hierarchy and power and governance. And so those would be the American Revolution. Especially important is the French Revolution. That, as we will see, was especially important in the rise of sociology and sociological theory. And the Haitian Revolution, which in some ways kind of picks up the torch from the French Revolution and then takes it further insofar as, it was a successful revolution by enslaved people who were living at that time in a French colony in the Caribbean islands. And so this also turns out to be a kind of an epical event, kind of like the beginning of the abolition, the end of slavery, that will sort of take, another 80 or so years during the 19th century, but eventually, we will see the abolition of slavery in the United States and in Cuba and in Brazil by the 1880s. And then finally, we have what we could consider maybe like an intellectual factor, also, a cultural or scientific factor in this case, which is the rise of the scientific revolution, which, really commences in the 15th and 16th century. New scientific ways about thinking about the world, about thinking about nature, about thinking about, about the planet, but that later develops into what we would call the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th and early 19th centuries. That is kind of a popularization of these scientific ideals in a way that begins to apply to sociology and politics and these sorts of things, insofar as they suggest that societies and issues of governance and power can be reorganized, can be restructured along the lines of the principles of science and reason and rationality. So all of these factors, I want you to think of as kind of like interrelated with one another. They're their own, sort of separate entities, but they really shouldn't be understood as like existing in isolation from one another. They're all kind of like at interplay with one another. So we'll go over each of these in a little bit more depth now. With regard to capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, like I said, capitalism as a sort of a system, a mercantile system, a system dominated by merchants who are trying to trade and sell high and buy low and sort of make money through the exchange of goods. That has very longer historical roots, that kind of mercantile system, certainly at least going back into the 16th century, and before that with Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas. But the Industrial Revolution has to be understood as kind of an accelerant of the development of capitalism. Basically, like the Industrial Revolution kind of puts the foot on the gas pedal of capitalism and takes things to a whole another kind of level, beginning really in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And then, as I said in the previous slide, it really takes root in the rest of Europe and in the United States a little bit later, more into like the middle of the 19th century, the mid 1800s. The Industrial Revolution was defined by these new kind of manufacturing processes, these new developments of mechanized factories, the use of coal and steam and water power. It really, in a lot of ways, it's the rise of the fossil fuel economy that is choking the planet today. Really has its roots in this industrial revolution. And it also involved like a new division of labor, a way of organizing the workplace that vastly increased productivity. We will see that this theme of the division of labor is an important one for the development of sociological theory. It's something that Adam Smith wrote very famously about in his book, The Wealth of Nations, going back to 1776. But it's also something that Marx and Engels wrote about in a much more critical fashion in their works, including the German ideology, in 1845, 1846. And then that Emil Durkheim will take up in his work called The Division of Labor in 1893. The reason that this is such an important concept, the division of labor, is because of its enormous social consequences in terms of the way that workplaces are reorganized and workers become sort of like specialists in one particular task. We'd be at the beginnings of what would later become like the assembly line kind of production, in which instead of like a craftsperson or some other worker creating a whole object on there by themselves, like say like a shoe by themselves, like a shoemaker, you would instead have a workplace of maybe dozens or hundreds in some cases of people who are performing particular specialized tasks over and over and over again. And what that will do is kind of multiply the productivity of the economy, and also will relegate workers to these really like monotonous, boring jobs in which, alienating jobs, as Marx will describe them, in which basically they're just like doing the same task all day, every day. And there's no sense of like craftsmanship or, any sense of like individual kind of creativity to the work. So the Industrial Revolution has to therefore be understood not just as like an economic transformation, but as something that changes the whole fabric of social life, particularly as it's concerned with social classes. Class inequalities worsen or become more extreme as a result of this industrial revolution. On the one hand, the accumulation of capital creates enormous wealth for a small number of, a sort of an elite of businessmen, what today we might call like the 1%. But it creates massive poverty and misery for a much greater number of workers. For example, when you watch the BBC documentary about the life of Karl Marx, you will learn that like workers during the Industrial Revolution in northern England, like in Liverpool and Manchester. Their life expectancy was like, I think it was like 25 or 26 years old, because people's lungs were so polluted from working in the mines, or just the air that they were breathing was just so toxic in these industrial cities. Children were regularly expected to work, including working in the mines from the time they were like 9, 10 years old. So child labor, massive misery, poverty, people who had been basically forced into into wage labor, because they had lost their access to land and the ability to sustain themselves, on a farm or in a village. And so masses of people are thrown into these industrial cities, like Liverpool and Manchester. Basically, they have to, kind of work now to, sustain a living, whereas previously they might have been able to supply their own needs. And it creates this, even more intensely stratified society, in which, on the one hand, you have, these factory owners that are making huge amounts of money, but on the other hand, you have workers who are, living these really miserable lives in a lot of ways. So industrialization is this change that kind of rearranges the whole fabric of social life. It's accompanied by the growth of cities, what we call urbanization, this mass migration of people to the cities, again, primarily because they've lost their access to land, to the commonly held land and resources that would have in past generations allowed them to subsist as peasants, as farmers and so forth. And so what this industrial revolution does is it kind of destroys this old way of life in which people had lived in these tight-knit, small-scale, villages and small towns where they had like directly personal relationships, like where they knew their neighbors, and they were closely connected with the land and the natural environment, and suddenly they're kind of like thrown out of that and forced into these cities that are dirty, that are polluted, that are but also characterized by these more like impersonal, more anonymous relationships. So this will be a thing that many generations of sociologists are, kind of tried to struggle with and to theorize and to understand this transformation from a society of, small, close-knit communities, where people were poor, but like they still they had, each other, they had, a sense of the commons, and a sense of the community, and they had access to land and subsistence, and that didn't mean that people didn't starve or didn't go hungry in times of drought or famine, but it was a different kind of way of living. And with industrialization and urbanization now, masses of people are thrown into these cities where they are kind of forced to fend for themselves. Like there is no like community to help pick people up. It's like, sink or swim. It's, it's fend for yourself. It's a dog eat dog, kind of environment that is dominated by these more impersonal, more anonymous relationships that increasingly revolve around like money and commodities and like what Marx will call exchange value. So some of the key texts that we'll be looking at this semester that like wrestle with the sociological consequences of the Industrial Revolution include, as I mentioned earlier, Marx and Engels, who start to look at this issue, especially of the division of labor, in their work, The German Ideology. Marx's, sort of magnum opus, his great work, Capital, certainly wrestles with all the various dimensions of this transformation, particularly as it happened in England. And finally, as I mentioned, also Emile Durkheim's work, The Division of Labor in Society, will address the sociological consequences, especially the sociological consequences of this thing of like going from small scale, tight knit, directly personal communities, which he will say are based on traditional kinds of solidarity, what he will call mechanical solidarity, and then more modern societies where you have these impersonal, anonymous relationships and a more intricately divided division of labor that he will refer to as being based on organic solidarity. It's just giving you a little preview of what's to come. Now, with the Protestant Reformation, as I mentioned, this is a kind of a cultural and religious and intellectual transformation that one can see as being like complementary to sort of like in harmony with the economic changes that were taking place with the rise of capitalism and then with the later with the Industrial Revolution. So the Protestant Reformation was basically this movement for religious reform that swept across Europe during the 16th century. And the cultural consequence of it, the consequence for people in society, was to foster a more individualistic sense of themselves and like their relationship to society. So Protestantism fostered the growth of individualism by spreading this idea that people should like read the Bible for themselves rather than leaving it to the priests. So there's the beginning of this idea of like individuals like thinking for themselves and taking intellectual inquiry upon themselves rather than just accepting what the hierarchical powers of the church told them. Similarly, people are encouraged by the Protestant Reformation to pray in terms that are made up by themselves, rather than to just repeat the official prayers that were handed down by the church. To develop a more, as people still put it, a personal relationship with God. All of these things are contributing not just like to a change in like the in Christianity, not just to a change within the church, but to foster a larger culture of individualism. And the connection between this like culture of individualism and the larger intellectual context of like reason and rationality, and how that's connected with the rise of capitalism, that will be taken up by the German sociologist Max Weber, whose writings we'll be looking at much more closely at the end of the semester. And so his essay, his book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, seeks to understand this relationship between religious change and economic change. in the most broad sense of the term. And Weber's argument, in some ways, is a kind of a challenge to Marx and to what Marx will call his method of historical materialism, by Weber is suggesting that like intellectual, religious, cultural factors were actually had a causal effect in reshaping Western societies. Whereas Marx might say, would say that economics is generally like the force, the motor of social change, the thing that causes societies to change over time. Weber's thesis will assert that it's intellectual, religious, or cultural factors. And it's led to this sort of long-standing and I think still like ongoing debate among historical sociologists, basically about like what's more important, intellectual factors or like material economic factors. So I, as I had mentioned before, like I'm kind of more sympathetic to the Marx side of things here, but it is a debate that is, sort of worthy of continuing to look at. Now, with the process of colonization, slavery, white supremacy, settler colonialism, again, as I said, like 1492 is really kind of like the benchmark date, and the enslavement and forced migration of African peoples that really begins to pick up a lot of steam, in the 1600s and 1700s. Transforms North and South America and the Caribbean islands. When we refer to like settler colonialism, we talk about Europeans coming in and basically colonizing those territories, from New England to Virginia to Cuba to Brazil. The colonization of these territories and basically the beginning of these kind of like genocidal wars against indigenous peoples, and these forms of enslavement that are legitimated, justified, rationalized in terms of an ideology of white supremacy, of racism, of the idea that these people basically can be colonized, exterminated, or enslaved because they're inferior, less than human, and whereas people of European descent are more, not just superior, but like closer to God somehow. There's a kind of a religious justification behind this as well. So European thought, is really kind of like laden with all of these assumptions, these like, these ethnocentric assumptions about, for example, the difference between primitive and civilized societies. That there's this kind of evolutionary notion that European societies represent a higher stage of progress or a higher stage of development. And that'll be kind of like baked into the cake of sociological theory, at least, until the 20th century, when that idea, that kind of ethnocentrism begins to be challenged by post-colonial theory and people coming from what we would today call the global South. But it was a kind of a taken for granted assumption throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century that, European societies were just simply more like civilized. They were just, more developed. and that, there was this kind of like evolution that needed to happen where like so-called primitive societies needed to, evolve and develop, and that meant, adopting, capitalist economic processes, or adapting, Western styles of democracy, or adopting, Christianity. There were just sort of all of these taken for granted assumptions that were sort of built into European thought, that replicated this kind of ethnocentric hierarchy. So, these are, again, like intimately connected with one another when you think about like how, for example, the Industrial Revolution was made possible by, in large part, by slave labor that was, creating all of this very cheaply created cotton, cultivating cotton that then could be, used in textile mills, and that kind of fueled the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. So, we need to understand like how it is that like these conditions of like colonization and slavery really, basically helped like accelerate the Industrial Revolution and the development of capitalism more generally. So with the political factors of modern nation states and the Age of Revolution, modern states kind of took over from like the kingdoms of the feudal era, and had a much greater capacity to shape social life, to create infrastructure, to also to regulate and govern social life, so to build roads and operate schools and collect taxes and regulate disease and public health. Governments, states, basically in the modern era start to take on greater responsibilities, and as well as a greater reach of power. Nations, so when we refer to like nation states, nations are kind of more of like, I suppose one could say, the cultural factor or the intellectual factor, in which people imagine themselves to be part of this community, that makes everybody Americans or Germans or French or whatever. But it's more of a kind of an intellectual conception that people have, that understanding themselves as a bounded, internally organized population. There's all sorts of things that contribute to the making of these imagined communities. The culture of a place, language, food, music, but also particular traditions, mythologies and narratives about how the country was founded or got started. All of these things contribute to the idea, again, more of a intellectual conception or a cultural conception that people have of being part of this nation state of Germany or France or the United States or whatever. Now, revolutions, as we mentioned with the Age of Revolution, come about with masses of people rising up to change the political institutions, to change the state, and to try to reorganize society at large. So, they are waged, first of all, in the name of the nation state, in the name of America or France or Mexico, or in the case of in other cases, the nation figures very prominently in people's, like why they fight and what they imagine themselves to be fighting for. So the revolutions of the 18th century, in particular, the French Revolution, as we will see, posed really significant questions about equality, freedom, human rights, democracy, slavery, the role of government. Of course, the American Revolution, for example, is a, complicated phenomenon that had, I suppose you could say, both progressive and reactionary elements to it. But it still, asserted this thing of like, all men are created equal. That it asserted this thing that was, a truly revolutionary ideal, even though, like, it was obviously contradicted by the way that indigenous people were being treated and dispossessed from their land and being killed in these genocidal wars. And it also, obviously, the statement "all men are created equal" was contradicted by the reality of slavery. And yet still on the world stage, to state this kind of thing was, a truly a step in towards equality that had not been taken to that point in the world, and that was, in that sense, revolutionary. The French Revolution will similarly, issue a declaration of the rights of man, and certainly that too has its contradictions and limitations insofar as, like, France still had, like slave colonies and this sort of thing. But the assertion of, the principles of freedom, liberty, equality, the rights of humanity, the ideal of democracy, these were all real, like, game changers on the world stage, because they kind of opened up new horizons and new possibilities. The French Revolution, in particular, was a fulfillment of these ideas that, we'll look at in the next slide, that had come about from the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, which, was that, to try to, like, reorganize society according to reason, rather than the traditional authority of king and church. So, the French Revolution had sort of asserted these ideas that of, like, that we can let, that the people, that the masses of people, and not just like the king and the queen and the aristocratic ruling class, can and should reorganize society according to democratic principles and according to equality and ideas of freedom and reason. And as I mentioned, with regard to, like, the Haitian Revolution, right, like, there will be, people who take this ideal even further, insofar as, the people who were enslaved people living on what was then the island called Saint Dominique, then a French, basically like a French, like, sugar producing colony. And they very much took these ideals of freedom, liberty, and equality very seriously, and then pushed them in ways that, like, the French had not necessarily intended, but pushed them to, what I would say as kind of like their logical conclusion in rising up against the tyranny of slavery. And so, the Haitian Revolution in many ways, even though, the French, it's certainly not, it was against it was a French colony, so they were, fighting against the French. Um, it was a sort of an extension of these principles in ways that were even beyond what their original authors had intended. Similarly, there's a women's movement, or at least a movement for women's equality that begins to kind of germinate out of this age of revolution. Mary Wollstonecraft, for example, writes on the vindication of the rights of women, I think in the 1790s. So right in the midst of this age of revolution, even though, like, the most of the original revolutionaries hadn't really put women's rights on the menu of when they talked about equality and freedom and liberty and democracy. They really just meant men. When they said all men are created equal, for example, they really just meant men. But there were, women who took these messages about liberty and freedom and equality and democracy and said, yeah, what about us too? And so there was a sort of a seed that had been planted there, that could be extended towards an even more radically egalitarian project than one that had been the initial intent of the revolutionaries themselves. So, as I mentioned, like the French Revolution, has to be seen in kind of connection with, and this whole age of revolution really needs to be seen in connection with, like, these intellectual developments that are taking place, in the realm of thought and philosophy and science. So the scientific revolution is sort of this, what at the time was enormously controversial. In some ways, we're still living with the conflict of science versus religion. I think, like, we've seen a lot of that with the controversies over vaccinations and all the stuff during the pandemic has still shown us that, like, science is not completely ever emerged victorious in its long-standing, centuries-long battle against superstition and the mysticism or irrationality that it associates with religion. So the scientific revolution basically took hold as an alternative initially to the traditional worldview that dominated early modern Europe. Early modern Europe, basically all the ideas were ones that were, sanctioned and then passed down by the church. And that was, the idea that the universe and nature and everything in the universe is this divinely created thing that, God had a master plan in creating and had ordered into, this kind of like hierarchy of humans and animals and plants and so forth. But this was all part, everything in the natural world was basically all part of God's master plan. And so, all you needed to understand the world was basically like the Bible. And not even the Bible, but like what the church said about the Bible, or what, the priests told you was true about the Bible. And so there was just this long-standing, assumption that nature and society were, basically like things that were spiritually created and infused with value and meaning and divine purpose, things that had been, ordained by God. And the scientific revolution, this happens over the course of, a couple hundred years. So successive generations of scientists come along and begin to, argue that no, this scientific world, this religious way of looking at the world is wrong. That the universe is not this divinely created result of God's master plan. It is, in fact, a mechanical system composed of matter that obeys these laws of nature that, are not like, they don't obey like God's laws. They obey their own sort of like internal natural laws. And that these natural laws, these natural processes can be understood by scientific methods, by the methods of observation and, collecting data and evidence and experimenting and, drawing up hypotheses and then, testing them out to see whether they're true or not, and building on previous forms of scientific investigation, all the things that, today we call the scientific method. As you can imagine, that was very much considered to be heresy, to be, a violation of God's thought, and more importantly, a violation of the church's hierarchy. And so, this is a period where people who are scientists, are sometimes like thrown in prison, or they're executed for, basically for the crime of going against the church. The Age of Enlightenment comes about kind of as a popularization or an extension of these scientific principles. And for our purposes as sociologists, the really important thing about the Age of Enlightenment is that it takes these ideas about science that originated with the study of nature and then applies them to the study of society. It basically says, like, we need to understand society and social dynamics, the social world, through these same kind of methods that have been used to study the scientific world, the natural world, right? So we need to put society and social relationships under the microscope and study them in the way that people had been doing with regard to the natural universe. So they really kind of popularized these ideas. They, kind of extended them out into a larger audience of educated Europeans during the 18th and 19th centuries. And also but also very importantly, connected it with an emerging like liberal humanistic worldview. And this will, again, be very important in the development of sociology. The question that the Enlighteners ask, is like, scientific may be this kind of neutral instrument for studying the world, but they also begin to see it as something that can enable social progress. In other words, if we reorganize society according to scientific principles, according to ideas of like reason and rationality, rather than the church and its doctrines and its superstitions and all this kind of thing, then we can have a better world. That social progress will come about if we just start reorganizing society according to the principles of science and reason. And so the idea was that this scientific method based on facts and observation would promote a society that was more where there was more individual freedom, where there was more tolerance and understanding, a society where equality and democracy could flourish. that will certainly be the idea that animates many of the French revolutionaries. The idea that we need to reorganize society in this more kind of scientific and rational direction. And if we do, it will have this progressive result of, a more equal, more individually free, more tolerant, more democratic society. So there's this connection kind of between like the intellectuals and the scientists who are working in the spirit of the Enlightenment and the forces of social change, the people who are calling for and organizing for a change in their societies. There's this confluence, this harmony between the intellectual and the political side of things. And, with that, as I said, they're very much a threat to the authority of the church and the whole Christian cosmology of, looking at the universe as this thing that was, created by God's master plan. So finally, we get to sociological theory. And it kind of comes out of this context, in conversation, especially as we'll see with the Age of Enlightenment and the aftermath of the French Revolution. That's, in part like why some of the earliest founders of sociology were French. They're wrestling with this, the sort of the intellectual and political legacies of the Age of Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and then trying to take these kind of scientific ideas and apply them to the study of society. The two key figures who are, mentioned in Randall Collins's book, The Discovery of Society, and who are, typically thought of as key founding figures in sociology are Saint-Simon, Henri de Saint-Simon, pardon my French, I'm sure I'm saying these people's names wrong, and Auguste Comte. And it's Comte who is usually thought of as the person that first like put sociology on the menu as like a thing, an academic discipline where you could use these scientific methods to study society and social dynamics. It's very important, though, although these people come out of this historical context, it's very important to understand that they are not simply internalizing everything that the Enlightenment had preached or had said, but also by counter-Enlightenment trends. And this is especially true with Comte, as we will see. That Comte didn't just sort of like swallow the Enlightenment whole and spit it back out in the form of sociology. That Comte was also influenced by what we can call a counter-Enlightenment of people who were critics of the Enlightenment, in particular because they were also like critics of the French Revolution. And also in some cases, like some of the early socialist critics of the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution and of capitalism. So it has to be understood as like kind of that sociology comes out of like a dialogue or a conversation or like an argument between the forces of the Enlightenment, the advocates of the Enlightenment on the one hand, and then a kind of more of a kind of a reaction to that Enlightenment from people that we consider like the counter-Enlightenment. So that includes, the counter-Enlightenment can't really be understood as being either like a left-wing or a right-wing thing, because it kind of incorporates a little bit of both. The counter-Enlightenment people were people who were critics of like economic individualism, of like the capitalist idea that individuals should just pursue their own self-interest, and to hell with social responsibility or the community or anything like that. So that would include a lot of people who were socialists, or early socialists were critics of economic individualism. They started to see how like the pursuit of profit and greediness was going to have these socially destructive qualities, and so they were not sort of on board with at least this part of the Enlightenment, or this part of like the modern world. Similarly, there are folks who are critical of the secularization of culture. This maybe comes more from like conservative intellectuals who thought, one sec, these conservative intellectuals who kind of thought that like the Enlightenment folks and the French revolutionaries were had kind of like thrown out religion and thrown out tradition a little bit too much, that maybe like society needed these forms of like religion or tradition in order to maintain a kind of social order. When these conservatives looked out at the world that the French Revolution had created, they saw a really chaotic, turbulent, disordered world in which people are getting their heads cut off in the middle of Paris, and power is changing hands like every so often, and they started to look at in the early 19th century at the aftermath of the French Revolution, and kind of like question whether it had been worth it, or whether if in fact maybe it wasn't such a good idea that people tried to reorganize society around principles of science and reason, that maybe they should stick to religion and tradition. And then finally you have like more kind of like romantic critics of the Enlightenment, people who they probably lean more towards the socialist end of things than the conservative end of things, but people more like artists and poets and people who were concerned with the idea that like science was kind of becoming too dominant over nature, and erasing some of like the mystery or the magic that had been in the sort of the pre-modern world. And so the romantics, particularly the artists and poets, tried to kind of maintain a hold in this sort of pre-modern world, and particularly with like the connection to nature, right? There's something that a sense that something is being lost, something important is being lost in this move towards science and reason, that people are now losing this kind of connection to a more spiritual sort of and perhaps more natural existence, right? So sociology kind of again comes out of this this dialogue, this argument between the Enlightenment and the counter-Enlightenment. And it kind of like takes a little bit of elements of both. There's certainly a lot where you can see that the Enlightenment influenced the development of sociology, but you can also see some counter-Enlightenment trends. And so we'll see that here as we look at Saint-Simon and Comte. Saint-Simon had been born, into a powerful and important aristocratic family, was, highly educated as a result. But as a young person, had been very rebellious. If you see when he was born in 1760, that would have meant that he was 29 years old when the French Revolution really started in earnest in 1789. He grew up in revolutionary times and was sort of a rebellious person, at least within this milieu of the aristocracy. And he, like the Enlightenment thinkers, believed that social progress could occur if society was organized on the basis of science. And for him, industrialism, the Industrial Revolution, represented this new stage of history insofar as it applied, scientific methods and the division of labor to, economic organization and towards the workplace. But far from being a simple proponent of industrialization and industrialism, like many economists in Britain were, Saint-Simon was a proponent of utopian socialism as a kind of an alternative to at least the worst effects of the Industrial Revolution. He's one of these people that's looking, at across to see what Britain is up to, and seeing all this child labor and these horribly polluted cities, and so he wants to somehow kind of like harness the insights of science and industry, but in a way, that he's imagining that would be more for the benefit of everybody, as opposed to just the benefit of, a small industrial capitalist class. So he preached, love and social harmony, and his followers started, forming all these kind of communes outside of Paris. And this would be part of what Marx and Engels would call utopian socialism, insofar as they imagined that, Saint-Simon kind of imagined that you could create a socialist society without having like the revolutionary class struggle and the violence and all that kind of thing. He thought you could just kind of like move from the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution into a higher stage of society that benefited everybody in a socialistic kind of way, but that you could do it just by continually advancing in these increments of progress. That you didn't need to have the bloody revolution in order for society to progress. That's where he is very different from the way that Marx and Engels would think about it, where revolution and class struggle were, for Marx and Engels, indispensable, unavoidable, as ways of getting to a higher or a better stage of society. So, Saint-Simon, had grown up in this aristocratic family, and maybe not coincidentally, he basically looked at the aristocracy, the ruling class, the church hierarchy as parasites on the rest of society, like bloodsuckers, who were basically feeding on the people and, not contributing anything original or productive or creative. So progress, he thought, instead of was when society was based on the rule of producers as opposed to these parasites. So he has this kind of dichotomy of thought that he's working with here, where on the one hand they're basically like the wealthy, powerful aristocrats who are just kind of sucking the blood out of everybody, and sitting on their asses and not really doing anything. And then you have like the producers, which who are out there creating useful goods and services, And he includes everybody in this, whether they're an industrialist, like an owner of a factory, or a worker in a factory. So he doesn't really have like a sense of class inequality, at least insofar as it connects with capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. He has more of this kind of like producers versus parasites, kind of way of thinking about the world. And so it kind of, in some sense, blinds him to what Marx and Engels will see, which is that, capitalism and industrialization doesn't erase class conflict. If anything, it heightens it to another level in the struggle between those who own and those who work. So, whether they're industrialists or workers or artists or poets, for Saint-Simon, these are all producers, and the struggle is against the parasites. And he basically believes that like the world will be better off if like these scientists and industrialists and even like bankers, like financiers, if they create, can come together and all, harmoniously decide that, just to create a better society. They're just going to create a more planned society that's for the good of everyone. So again, it rings very naive now, but this idea of like that, if we just take these ideas of science and industry and reason and rationality and we apply them to society, that we can just, create a better world for the benefit of everybody. And we just have to, come to a consensus and decide to do that. So it's a kind of a naive idea insofar as it leaves out this thing that Marx and Engels will talk about as class struggle. So it's a kind of an ideology of industrialism, the idea that progress is based on science, that new societies can be created without revolution or without violence, just by putting like the scientists and the industrialists in charge. If we just put like Elon Musk and Dr. Fauci together, then they would like create a better world for the benefit of everybody. That's sort of like the underlying assumption here. So it is a very kind of like elitist, like it in some ways like it's a utopian socialist kind of ideal, but it is elitist in the sense that like it's the experts who are supposed to create this better society that then will be beneficial for everybody in the world. Whereas Marx and Engels believe that change to a better society has to come from the bottom up, that it has to come from workers and the oppressed organizing and rising up and taking the lead in the revolution. You're never going to get a better world if it's imposed from the top down by science and experts and scientists and experts and industrialists and certainly not from bankers or Elon Musk. So Auguste Comte comes along as basically like is Saint-Simon's like kind of like his student or his apprentice. Again, it's somebody with very wide-ranging intellectual interests, who's originally trained in math and sciences, but then, to this day is kind of regarded as like, the founding father of sociology, Auguste Comte. So he starts as this kind of assistant to Saint-Simon. They, have this kind of acrimonious split in 1824. And he kind of moves on from there to develop this idea for a scientific discipline called sociology. Again, Comte's ideas formed during this period of like the aftermath of the French Revolution. So like 30 or 40 years after the revolution had begun. but still this very turbulent period, very violent period, and in which like power, had changed hands multiple times. There had been, like a revolution, and then the monarchy, like, retakes power, and there's, it's a very unstable kind of society. And so Comte, as we'll see, like, takes a lot of ideas from the Enlightenment, but by this time, he's also found some reasons to be kind of skeptical of and critical of the Enlightenment, and wondering if, like, there isn't a limit or, a cautionary example to be learned from trying to reorganize society according to principles of science and reason. So his main concern, in this period in 1830s and 40s, will be with order. How can society maintain order? How do societies, what's the cement that can hold societies together? And I think this is in large part because he's growing up at, intellectually coming of age in such a turbulent, chaotic, and violent period. So he wants to know, he basically divides sociology, his initial thought is basically sociology can study like these two things, the things that are static and the things that are dynamic, right? So the sources of social change and progress. As we've seen, Comte would certainly include like science and scientific thought in that, as a force of social dynamics, as a force of change and progress. But he's also interested in what he calls the social statics, the sources of order and stability. And this Comte is kind of like, I get the sense that he's kind of like, maybe we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, as the expression goes. That maybe like the French revolutionaries, had decided like, we're just going to get rid of like religion and tradition and, the church and all of these kind of superstitions from the past. And we're going to like start over, and it's going to be a new day based on principles of science and reason. And we're going to get rid of all that old shit, and Comte is maybe coming along and saying like, well, maybe, maybe we needed some of the, maybe we needed some like, religion and tradition or these sources of social order, that maybe it's not a good idea to just like try to start over with creating a new society on day one. Maybe it's not even like possible to do that, and if you do try to do that, perhaps the result is like, chaos and disorder and violence. I think that's where Comte is kind of coming from. So he presents this thing that he calls like the law of three stages. And this is very much on a trajectory of like progress. And, it's very clearly influenced by the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and the idea that science leads to social progress. So he says basically like, you look at societies that they go through these three stages, that at the most, I guess, primitive level, he says, in the first stage, humanity, societies are based on theological assumptions, basically like religion, where like the human mind explains the origin and purposes of things through supernatural entities. So through spirits and divine beings, and then, eventually to a singular God. Right? So that at the most basic level, or the most, he probably would say like the most unevolved level, humanity is dominated by this theological phase of things. And then the metaphysical stage represents, a form of progress in which now the mind begins to look to essences or abstract forces, like reason and natural law and philosophy. So it represents a break, the beginnings of a break away from the theological religious mindset. And then for him, the highest stage is what he calls the positive stage, that's obviously associated with scientific knowledge, where the mind, and people's minds don't just like accept church doctrine or look for some sort of supernatural explanation for things, but instead are bound to the facts and to evidence that's accumulated through methods of observation and experimentation and scientific investigation. So this law of three stages, again, represents a very, it kind of reproduces this assumption of social progress, that human societies kind of progress from, the superstitions of religion to philosophy to science, or another way of putting it is, from speculation to truth. And that as societies progress in their methods and forms of knowledge, then societies will progress in becoming more democratic, more equal, more tolerant, and also, like more productive. So that there's this connection between progress in knowledge and progress in society. These are things he's clearly internalized from the Enlightenment, and then comes about to apply to sociology, which he pronounces the queen of all the sciences. He imagines that sociology will be, the most perfect form of scientific knowledge, because it'll accumulate all these insights and data and hypotheses and conclusions from all these other disparate forms of knowledge, right? And so sociology will be the ultimate form of knowledge about like what makes people and what makes societies tick, So it would be the most complex, the most concrete. It would integrate all of this knowledge about humanity. And I think the most original thing Comte has to say that will be taken up, especially by Emile Durkheim, is that society should be treated as a thing in itself. That kind of, in scientific terms, this means that society should be looked at as the unit of analysis, that society has its own dynamics, and should be treated as a kind of an organism unto itself, rather than society just being looked at as the sum of individuals, or just like, a collection of individuals all doing their own thing. Society has to be understood as a network of relationships, as understood as social interactions with rules and institutions that are independent of individuals. So not just as like the sum total of individuals, but something that actually shapes individual lives, especially rules and institutions, forms of social interaction that shape people's lives as much as people, or more so than people shape society. So again, for him, the thing is like, how can we organize that society with its rules and institutions in order to maintain social order? Under what conditions does this social organism operate with, a kind of an internal order in which it reproduces itself and maintains a certain kind of stability or equilibrium. This will also be Emile Durkheim's method when we get to Durkheim, to examine society as a kind of organism, as a thing in itself, rather than the sum total of the individuals who comprise it. So, Comte is kind of like looking towards human development in history, as progressing towards perfection and changes, in the social and political institutions that go together, that correlate with the evolution of people's intellectual thinking. So, again, as as people begin to think in more, he would say complex terms, then societies will in turn progress into a more like civilized stage or less primitive stage. And at that positive stage, at that last of the three stages, he kind of shares what Saint Simon had thought, which is that you basically you want to put the industrialists and the scientists in charge, because they're the ones who are most in touch with the positive stage of intellectual development. They're the ones who are every day dealing with science and industry and these kind of practical matters. And so we just need to put these kind of experts in charge. And so, Comte sees, there's this part of him that is very much like a product of the Enlightenment, right? That there's very much like he sees that, there might be problems and conflicts, and there are obviously a lot of problems and conflicts in his day and age, but that still society's kind of overall moving in a progressive direction. That the long arc of history bends towards not justice in this case, but some sort of like progress or truth or science or industry. I suppose he would probably include in that. But there's also a part of Comte that is influenced, as I said earlier, by the counter-Enlightenment, by the criticism of the Enlightenment that is leveled by conservatives and by the church. He also believes basically hey, these people have a point too. He looks around at all of the, sort of social instability of post-revolutionary France and says, like I said earlier, maybe we threw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe the Enlightenment failed to understand the value of tradition and custom, especially insofar as it was embedded in religion. There's part of Comte that thinks we shouldn't just throw out religion and tradition in the name of science and reason. So Comte, it's really fundamentally ambivalent in the way that he sees the world and the way how he looks to the future. You can really see these Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment tendencies being played out in the same person. So, at this time, France is really in this period of social crisis. There are these violent, power struggles. Increasingly, they don't seem like reasonable or rational at all. They don't seem really based on ideas. They seem more just kind of like violent power struggles. The monarchy retakes power in the early 19th century, and then of course Napoleon Bonaparte comes and takes power. There's a whole as a whole lecture unto itself. And but also, besides the political power struggles, Comte is also seeing the disorder that is being created by industrialization, right? So he is seeing the social strains, the conflicts that are being created, even though France, was still at this point pretty pre-industrial. France really doesn't, in Comte's time is still a mostly agrarian society where, most people are peasants working the land. And the cities and industry are developing, but it's still a mostly agrarian society. And Comte is seeing that, industrialization, while it certainly has its benefits as far as, being a productive economic system, it also has some major drawbacks in terms of, kind of like tearing up the social fabric. And so Comte, he certainly was no Marxist. He certainly, Marx will take this critique much further. But he is beginning to, there is part of him that's, influenced by this counter-Enlightenment thought insofar as it's causing him to be critical or at least ambivalent about the effects of industrialization. In his time, there's kind of like this three-sided class struggle that's going on, where you have the church and the aristocracy, the old like feudal elite, who had ruled over the countryside, in their little mini fiefdoms and kingdoms. And then you had, the bourgeoisie, right? The more of like the industrialists and the bankers and, like the capitalist class that was sort of rising up and taking more power, especially more economic power, but also challenging for political power, which is a lot of what the French Revolution was about. And so you have these competition between these two, ruling classes, an older, more established ruling class in the church and the aristocracy, and a sort of up and coming ruling class in the bourgeoisie of the capitalist class. And then you have the mass of society, what today we might call the 99%. That probably wasn't exactly 99% then, but let's call them, the 90% or the 85% of peasants, laboring people, craftsmen. But again, like the bulk of France at this time is the peasantry, and they too would play, an active role in the French Revolution for different reasons, not so much for out of power, but kind of out of protest and out of inequality and deprivation. And then you have like this, this rising working class that's still comparatively small in, especially compared to like England, but it's rising, and especially in Paris, this industrial working class, will become increasingly revolutionary. And then, you also have these craftspeople who are, like were maybe like shoemakers or people that had a particular craft that was being threatened by industrialization. The craftspeople were basically being threatened with like being sunk into the level of the working class and the proletariat, basically being forced to go out and work in a factory for a living. So you have all these kind of contending classes and this very sort of conflicted environment. So when we look next time at these thinkers, Alexis de Tocqueville and Harriet Martineau, I'll do this in the next lecture. We see people that are like the next generation after Comte, and they're dealing with a lot of these same kind of issues about the legacy of the Enlightenment and also the critique of the counter Enlightenment. But they're doing it in a context where they're looking at a relatively young, new country that's sort of putting those principles into practice at the time, and that's the United States of America. So both Tocqueville and Martineau are basically French intellectuals who come out of this milieu of thought, and then they come and travel to the United States like in the 1840s, and each write different accounts about American society. And so we will, kind of pick it up with them next time. All right, I'm going to stop the share. Thank you very much. See you next time.